Okay, I'm going to move on while we're signing here to the Dascomb Road Zoning Task Force. This is basically for the Board of Selectmen to review and approve the revised charge for the Dascomb Road Zoning Task Force. Town Manager?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the board may recall, I presented a draft charge of the Dascomb Road Zoning Task Force, which at that time was the ID2 Zoning Task Force. Based on the input from the board, we tightened that charge up a little bit to be specific to a project, specifically on Dascomb Road, the parcel mainly in question, or where the proposal, based on Lapoli Company's presentation at the last selectmen's meeting, is 146 Dascomb Road. We modified the charge, included it in your packet. I'm just asking the board to revote it, and upon revoting it, I'll proceed as part of that vote with populating the committee and having them get to work. So, or the task force, excuse me. So,
I don't have it now again.
Yeah, and I could not see it in Dropbox.
Dropbox, for some reason, is not working at all. So.
Yeah, I don't have it.
Do you not have it, or is it not working?
Both.
It's certainly in the packet, but if we're having technical difficulties.
It was the last page of the packet.
Right, we don't have it.
It's difficult to hear what you're saying.
Sure, so the only change from the prior vote of this board is that we tightened it up to have the charge of the task force be specific to, rather than ID2 townwide, a proposed project at 146 Dascomb Road. And really, the proponent has indicated that he will be coming in under the existing zoning or under a potential change, assuming it's approved by the town. And really what I'd like to see this group do is a comparative analysis of the associated impacts under existing zoning and what's allowable by right and what is being proposed. So this task force, the charge will be to focus on a potential project at Dascomb Road.
And by proponent, me, Mr. Lapoli, just so we're clear for the
Correct.
record, the Dascomb Road project.
Correct.
This board, I abstained, but this board was in kind of a hurry to set up this ID2 zoning task force back at the end of June, beginning of July. What happened? Why wasn't that task force populated with such urgency? Because there was a forced vote to say we can't afford to lose time. So why wasn't it populated based upon its mission at the time?
Based on the feedback at that board meeting, I made a decision to slow it down, solicit feedback, give Mr. Lapoli an opportunity to come before the board, and that's why we're here today.
But it was, okay, but it was made very clear when the zoning task force, the ID2 zoning task force was discussed by this board back at the end of June, beginning of July, it was clear this wasn't about a project. In fact, it was put forward that this was a task force to look at all ID2, both River Road and Dascomb Road, to look at the possible impacts of residential housing, and it was said this had nothing to do with the Lapoli project. And now, fast forward, nothing ever happened with that. At the last meeting, I think our chair even said, well, we knew something was coming, I assume, from Mr. Lapoli. So this got delayed, and now it is, in fact, a Dascomb Road task force.
Correct.
Okay, I mean, just...
And it's in response to feedback from this board who gave me an indication that the charge needed to be tightened up and project specific.
Well, feedback from this board when, though? I don't recall a public meeting where we talked about changing, other than when Mr. Lapoli came in at the last meeting and introduced his new plan. Have we publicly discussed changing ID2 to the Dascomb Road Task Force in public?
In my recollection, at the meeting in which we the board initially voted to approve it, there was some discussion about ambiguity of the charge.
Well, there's ambiguity of charge, but that was brought up by, I think, Selectman Vespoli when he abstained because he felt it was too ambiguous to vote on. So the vote was 3-2, or 3-0-2, because Mr. Vespoli and I both abstained. And I just get concerned when we put something forward like that. It was, in my view, a charade. It was in my view that it clearly was the Dascomb Road Task Force. This clearly was all about the Lapoli project, and yet it was painted as some ID2 zoning task force that's going to look across board, and now nothing happened on that. No action was taken. No discussion by this board was taken in public session. And here we are, and Lo and behold, it is in fact a Dascomb Road task
It
force.
evolved, though. It evolved into something that it is today.
It evolved when? Mr. Napoli just came in at our last meeting.
Okay, that's
as far as I
evolution.
knew, there was
That is the
nothing going
evolution.
on. Okay, and so what explains why we took no action between July and then? If this had nothing to do with the Napoli project, we weren't waiting on them. Why weren't we moving forward?
I don't understand your concern about all of that. I don't understand it at all, but I do understand that this is obviously a very important piece of real estate in this town that could actually transform that entire area into something very valuable for the town. So getting it right, again, and not fast, is important, is it not?
Well, it may be. There are a lot of people that have concerns about the development of that area. But I want to go back. You're talking about as the change in the charge. I'm talking about the original charge. The original charge flat out said this was looking at ID2 and changing it to ID3 and what the implications were going to be. And it was across the board, both the River Road ID2 and the Dascomb Road ID2, and that is what this group was going to be put forward. There was a big rush to get this approved at that meeting in June or July, whenever it was, and it was put through, and then nothing happened. It stayed silent. Work that could have been going on didn't get done. And for it to be characterized back then, quote, "This task force has nothing to do with the Napoli project, nor the $6 million state economic development grant." That was you, Paul Salafia, accusing the townsmen of having a blatant disregard for facts when in fact they had it right. This was always about the Napoli project, and now it's simply being admitted that it was about the Napoli project. Having said that,
All right, now you mentioned my name, so let me talk.
Please do.
Okay, so it's interesting that you don't seem to want this project to evolve into something that's very good for the town. Back then, that was exactly correct. So it was not a charade. No smiles here, Bob. This is not funny. This is important.
don't
okay?
tell me how to act. You can say what you like.
Okay, but you're smiling.
Because it was a charade, that's why I'm smiling. I think it's comical.
Somebody's gonna get you a puppy or something. You're an angry guy.
I have a puppy.
You're always angry.
She's beautiful.
But bottom line is that this has evolved into something that is very good. Many of the concerns that people had were in front of you last meeting were absolutely vetted. So now you see that school concerns, some of the traffic concerns, certainly overall it is a much better project, so it's best to wait. Why do things fast when you can do them right?
My issue was mischaracterizing this task force for what it was when we knew what it was. You knew it was the Napoli-Dascomb
You
Road
thought
Task
that.
Force.
You thought that, not
Well,
anybody else.
And I was proven to be right, wasn't
No,
I?
you weren't.
Really?
It
Okay.
evolved. Bob.
Okay.
It evolved. Things can change.
Okay,
Things
well,
can evolve.
okay, well, I've said what I said about the evolution. Now let's talk about the task force itself.
I have a question
What?
about the task force.
Yes.
Could you give me some description? And again, I looked at it in the packet a few days ago, which we can't access now, and I was trying to save paper and didn't print. Can you describe the population that you're looking for to put on this task force and the representation? Because I know that's been a concern of a number of people in town, both that are in favor and potentially against any development at that site.
Sure, so I'll begin with the liaisons. There'll be a liaison from the Finance Committee, a liaison from the Board of Selectmen. There'd be 3 residents that are in the vicinity of the proposed site, 2 residents at large, a resident from the senior community, 3 members from the neighborhood, the Dascomb Road neighborhood, 2 residents at large, a liaison from the Board of Selectmen, a liaison from the Finance Committee, a designee of my office. Then staff liaisons would be the Director of Planning to answer zoning questions, the Chief of Police to address traffic, his designee's traffic concerns, and a Director for Municipal Services where there is a significant infrastructure component. Did I miss it?
Did you answer your question, Laura?
And a member of the DRB and a local business owner,
Downtown business?
most likely downtown.
That's good.
Correct, yep.
Does that answer your question, Laura?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
That's our question of the audience, ma'am?
Are we sticking with the board
Paul-
first?
Paul, I
Go
have
to
a
the audience?
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
Andrew and I
Hold on for a
apologize.
second.
I can wait till Selectman
Okay.
Disco
Okay.
talks.
Thank you. Alex?
Thank you. My question to Andrew, I don't have the charter, so maybe it can be emailed to me, but what's the desired outcome of this task force specifically? What's the charge going to be?
From my perspective is it's essentially to do a comparative analysis of what are impacts if developed by right today versus a potential zoning change. There have been a few things that have been discussed. ID3, PUD. So my hope for this group is to dig deep into that and come back to this board with a completed analysis of associated impacts. So when we do
my point was before, the last time this was proposed, that was referred to, my concern was if it's not specific, then the task and the charter of the group with any kind of ambiguity, you're not going to get what you want. So I think that it's got to be extremely tight as far as if you want a comparison of what's allowed by right versus what's allowed with the zoning change, which contemplates the residential use. I think those are the two different aspects, right, of the proposal.
correct.
Is that where you're going with it? So
and that's included in the
want
charge.
to take a look at it before I can take a vote, but I can take a look at it if you can email it to me or whatever. But to me, that's the biggest, as I said in my comments last time, this is where task force and committees go sideways or have the opportunity to go sideways if it's not explicit on what you want the outcome to be.
And in that light, we tried to make it quite clear of what the charge would be.
Secondarily, not including the charter, only because it's the topic. I requested in the last meeting when Mr. Lipoli was there that we ask for a definitive request or definitive answer from Secretary Ash's office on two different things. One is, and I would hope, Andrew, I didn't see a letter, but I would ask you to respectfully in writing to him, ask specifically what is the difference in the grant if the project is moved forward as of right, and then if it's moved forward with the residential component to it. And I asked, I was very clear in the last meeting, even though I was on the phone, which I know is sometimes a little tough, but I'd like to see a letter to the Secretary directly asking him what the differences are in that grant, because it's, I haven't seen anything in writing about that grant, but if we can get that also would probably be input to the task force as well.
Could I,
the community.
Alex, are you done? I wanted to address that.
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
Okay. I've been in touch with Secretary Ash's office. I did a public records request a few months back. I also exchanged emails with the public records officer. And if you recall, this MassWorks grant of about $6 million, there was big fanfare. There was a check signing ceremony just before town meeting. And it was literally just before town meeting that there was disclosure to the town that, quote, some portion of the $6 million grant would not be there if there was not a residential component. Am I capturing that accurately, Andrew? Okay, good. I asked Secretary Ash's office for any documents, written evidence that showed internal communications or internal documentation that document the conditions under which the $6 million would be reduced without a residential component. The answer was there are no such documents. There are no such documents. So somebody in Secretary Ash's office apparently just gave us a verbal. There is no internal process that showed communication, that showed that there was a approval process or anyone signed off on that. It was simply a verbal statement made by somebody with no documents to back it up.
Do you not recall the grant application had a specific paragraph in it that identified that the grant had a residential component in the grant application? Don't you recall reading that?
Yes, I do. And I remember when we did the application, we sat here and said that it has a residential component, but it was subject to town meeting. It was clear up front. This was subject to town meeting. What I'm talking about is Alex's specific question, which is getting an answer from Secretary Ash. Town meeting was back in early May. The grant was announced in late April. And here we are in the middle of September, and we don't have a letter of intent. We could easily have from Secretary Ash's office, okay, if you go this way, if you go without the residential component, based upon what you've been talking about, here's your grant, and here's the $1 million adjustment, $2 million adjustment, that if you don't have a residential component. But our application specifically said it is subject to town meeting vote. That there was no town meeting vote. There was no town meeting vote. But I was answering Alex's question.
How could the...
Yeah, I think it's a fair request. I mean, it's not, we're not, there's no judgment here. It's just, just some clarification. Because, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Alex, you please continue.
No, I think it's a good piece of information because, the town's gonna weigh in on it, and I think it's just, it's all, the cards kind of face forward to see what this whole thing is. It puts the whole thing in focus. So, I think it's just a common sense request, and it's just a follow up from the entire process.
I mean, personally, I can understand why the state can't communicate what percentage of the grant would be granted, because a lot is dependent upon the project that goes there. I mean, the grant was a partnership between the state, the town of Andover, and the developer, Mr. Lafoli. So I can certainly understand why the state can't provide documentation as to how much the grant would be reduced, and I'm sure it's a process by which they have to go through. Now, I'm not comfortable, Andrew, instructing you as an individual member of the board to send a letter to the state. I mean, anything that, if Selectman Vespoli would like a letter drafted to the state, potentially from himself, he certainly could draft that letter. But if there's a desire from the board to draft a letter to the state, that's a different issue. So the board needs to decide whether a letter from the Andover Board of Selectmen is appropriate.
Well, I don't know if the town manager, he can request it. I don't
Right,
know if
as
that's
the town manager, I'm sure, he can request it if he feels it's necessary, but we, the Board of Selectmen, shouldn't be instructing the town manager how to do his job.
We have a very good working relationship with the Secretary's office, and we've tried to maintain a dialogue throughout this process, and I will follow up. If the board wants me to draft a letter to have it consider voting to send, we can do that. We've done it in the past with other executive offices, but I can assure the board that I will follow up.
This entire discussion needs to be framed in its historical. This is an economic development grant. In order to understand, you need to understand that they don't sit there and say, "Oh, I want to give Andover some money." They have a calculator. They look at the square footage of what is being proposed. They look at the possible success. They have an algorithm that tells them the possible success of something of a project if in fact residential is attached to it. They look at a lot of different factors, and they come up with an ROI, a return on investment. They determined that given the conditions that were being proposed at the time, that a $6 million grant was in order. Now, Secretary Ash came here. He said to all of us, to our faces, that he's going to give us a $6 million grant. It was based upon a specific project. So if that project changes, the grant may change. He does not have a specific project in front of him now, but he knows a project will be coming. I had direct, unlike anyone else, I didn't speak to anyone else in his office. I spoke to Secretary Ash directly, asked him those questions directly. And his answer was, I will adjust it upward or downward in any case according to a project. But in any case, he was not looking to remove the grant, pull the grant back at all. He was just wanted to react to a project. So any discussions moving forward, you have to understand that. So I'm not sure he can actually give us a letter saying we're going to give you $5,996,000 based upon this project, because he can't do it, or $7 million based upon another project, because he can't do it just yet. But he is committed to the project.
Can I bring us back to the agenda, Mr. Salafia.
Yes, it is the agenda, but you're here.
Well, bring us back to
Tell us
the
who you are
task, to
again.
the task force component of the agenda.
Tell us who you are again, I'm
Elizabeth
sorry.
Hedstrom Henlin from Osgood Street. I wanted to ask the Board of Selectmen to consider, based on the charter that the town manager has just outlined, first to adjust the number of residents on the local, by which I would define it as within a square mile of the proposed site, to 4 rather than 3, with leaving it to 1 resident at large. Andrew, I think that does the math right, 5 residents in total. The only reason being for my request is that Mr. Lupoli has made it clear to those of us in the neighborhood who he has met with that he is moving ahead with what he is entitled to develop by right, as well he should. He owns the land. We will be those most directly affected, so I would like to request that we have 4 rather than 3 spots on the board so that we can be collaborative partners with him in helping him and the town to understand the realities in which we currently live. Second, the other request I would make is that the Board of Selectmen consider adding compliance with wetlands and traffic remediation explicitly in the charter of the task force. Dascomb Road is currently an FF as it is. To be honest, all I've seen is a concept. All Mr. Lupoli had at that time was a concept. And so for the sake of all of us who want the town to both get a larger share of the tax pool, but also not move from FF to something that is candidly outside of the state's definitional grid in terms of risk and unsafety to those of us that live in the neighborhood. So putting that in the specific charter of the task force, I feel would also add an additional level of openness, transparency, and collaboration between those of us in the town, you of the board and the planning board, as well as those of us that live in the neighborhood and those that don't necessarily live proximate to cars turning around at speed in our driveways at all hours of day and night already, or run the risk of parked cars moving up and down our streets rather than try to go into a parking lot area that is, I've been around real estate a long time, ladies and gentlemen, let's be real, underdeveloped for the amount of density that's currently being outlined. I won't say proposed because there is no proposal. So if we could consider those 2 things first, moving the balance a little bit further towards local, by which I would define as within a square mile of the site residents. And second, adding specific charter around compliance with wetlands, regulations, and traffic, and I would even say traffic and parking remediation for the site as proposed.
Wetlands, it's by law, they have to. I mean, it's not, that's not even going through all of the board process, all of that. And if you heard Mr. Lupoli, he will have a traffic, and we will be able to, the town, hire anyone we want as a traffic review, peer review. So, and he will pay for it. So it's not as though, it'll be completely independent of peer review. So.
Mr. Lupoli has moved the needle, I would say, notably in what he's said. But I will not borrow from Ms. Flanagan of earlier, but you're going to be seeing a lot more of me at these meetings going
We will
forward.
be holding him to his word, believe me, we will.
And we will be here to help you in doing that.
Good.
Thank you very much.
You're
Excuse
welcome.
me, Andrew, could I ask you a question on that?
Paul, I could hear some of that. It sounded like a reasonable request to make.
Yes,
The young lady
absolutely.
from speaking.
Absolutely.
I had a question, follow up on the traffic study that Ms. Lupoli was talking about offering to pay for the town to do an independent traffic study. Now, isn't that just the normal process if he were to go before the planning board and they ordered a traffic study, that there would be a peer review and he would have to pay for it anyway? So it's not as if he's doing anything that he wouldn't have to do if he just went through the normal process, right?
Correct. The only difference is he may be, and I don't want to speak for Mr. Lupoli, to fund it prior to filing permit. I mean, that was my understanding
Which would bypass the normal planning board process.
No,
right?
no. The planning board process would still exist, but it would assist in the task force work.
But doesn't to do a peer review traffic study, don't they need the initial study to be done?
Yes.
Correct.
So there would be a kind of they have to be contiguous, right?
So what essentially happens is the developer, the proponent, does a study. We send somebody in to peer review it. I think what was proposed here was that this board would accept a gift because it would have to.
But it's not a gift. I guess that was my point. I don't want this being characterized as a gift. I know it's characterized that don't worry, you do your own independent review and I'll pay for it. the reality is, going through the planning board, any other developer, that would be their process. They
You are
would have to,
But it's about timing.
right? I'm not talking about the timing. I'm talking about that this is not some gift to the town so we can do our own traffic study. It would be, in fact, a mandatory peer review that would come through the planning board anyways, correct?
Correct.
That's all I want, that's my only
The
point.
timing is different because the task force would then, because it happens earlier, the task force would then be able to avail itself of all of the initial traffic information and then the town's peer review of that information way prior to the planning board, and then the planning board would again be able to, and petition for another peer review if they thought that was insufficient. So it is a significant event in that the timing is so much better for the town because we will have more information earlier in the process, and it can be peer reviewed even again if necessary. So it is actually quite a good situation for the town. Yes, ma'am.
Janet Clark on 5 Carriage Hill Road.
Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Mr. Lapoli and his team came to our house and met with about 18 of others Tuesday night. And I would like to address the idea of the task force here and what Mr. Vispoli was pointing out on the charge to the task force and what it's going to study. And I liked what he said with the impact with either the by right, what he can put in there, which he's proposing 660,000 square feet of mixed-use commercial properties, or how that would be, how he thinks it's a better project with housing, and he's proposing senior 55 plus housing now. And for all of us to begin to understand what it is, what it will be like, how it will look, how it will affect us who live right there within an eighth of a mile of this project. He's saying that there will be added traffic between 7,500 and 10,000 cars a day added to an interchange that's already just tremendously overwhelmed, and at times during the day backs up, and as it's been pointed out, they come and turn around in our streets, our driveways. The traffic is probably our number one concern. My other concerns are shops, businesses drawing from downtown, the change of the image of Andover to add a very large commercial project, to add more housing. We have large apartments. The 133 interchange now has become a major commercial zone, and with large apartments also. And now Dascomb Road is becoming the same massive commercial area. And just the change to this residential community that I moved into.
So you're asking the task force to
I'm asking the task force to
take a look at that?
take a look at that. And Mr. Lapoli is just very adamant that it would be less of an impact with apartments. How do I know? How do any of us, our residents, know what's good for Andover? He's going to build something there.
Well, let me
So
just say that
what's the best option, and how can we figure that out?
that's exactly what I think the town manager is proposing.
So
is
if
a
it
by
can-
right and a
So if we can tighten up that charge and maybe add more residents to the group,
good.
and it seems really odd, but, and I don't understand exactly why Mr. Lapoli feels like he doesn't know how to go forward and how to work with the town, how to work with the residents. But that's the way he seemed totally confused when asked, how are we going to move forward?
Well, the task force, I think, will give us some direction, will give us some comparison, and he'll get some information from that.
Yeah, he states he wants to work with everybody. He wants to work with so if we could, we would say we don't want this project as a personal group of people. That's not true for everybody that's out there on Dascomb Road. There's some people who think it's a good idea, but it will change our lives dramatically and the feel of the town, I think, too. So, let me see, what kind of senior housing, what does Andover need for senior housing? Is this going to be a positive thing?
Bad thing for the charge
Yeah.
either.
So, to try to come up with a charge that, to this task force, and to put more residents on it, I think would be my recommendation. So we have to figure it out. Thank you.
May I suggest that, and maybe the board will chime in, that we adjust, hearing some of the objections, that we adjust the charge and send it back out?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Can I ask a question as well?
Sure, I just wanted to finish so just adjust the charge and maybe we can, I'd like to populate it sooner than later too, but what do you think?
So there's, as proposed, is 5 residents, 3 in the Dascomb neighborhood, 2 at large. I would personally have no problem going 4 and 1.
Sure.
That's certainly reasonable.
I think we ought to keep 2 at-large residents and just increase the other one to 4.
We can do that.
Because we need to make sure that the entire town's represented, that there are many different perspectives in our town, and we need to make sure that all of them are represented on the committee, and so that anything that we do is part of everyone in town.
I agree. I think it should be.
1 and 2.
And one more thing, that they have about completed their traffic study, and probably by the end of this week or early next week, it will be submitted to the town.
Great. Sir?
Sir, Dan Isdale for Surrey Lane. Just a logistical question. I heard you say, and I agree with this, it's important to do it right and not fast.
Right.
At the last Board of Selectmen meeting, Mr. Lapoli indicated that he intended to submit a petition for a fall town meeting in or around Thanksgiving. So just in terms of timing, to make sure that this task force has the time it needs to give residents the information.
And I think that's a concern, and we'll be talking about that.
Okay, so do we have any sense of when?
Right and not fast is what we need to do.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about a special town meeting that the town's going to call for a reason specific to a matter completely
Yes.
different than this tonight. It will be up to Mr. Lapoli to decide whether or not he's going to submit a private warrant article related to a proposed project there. I don't know if we have any indication of what the
My
plan
only
is there.
concern would be,
Have the answers.
yeah, if it does go before town meeting, I just would like to know if the task force has been populated, staffed. I have been the closest home to the 146 Dascomb parcels.
Sure.
I just want to make sure that we have, as a town, time to kind of give the task force the time they're going to need to do the work they're going to do. I just
It's a
wanted to
concern.
find that out.
And just to answer the question, is there a tentative date that's been thought about for a town meeting?
The date that I was going to ask the board to, with regard to their availability, your availability, would be December 11th.
December 11th?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, my first reaction to that date, in the middle of the holidays, is going to be an awfully tough time to have a special town meeting to talk about an issue this big.
Well, it's also North Reading Water.
It's also what?
Oh, I'm sorry, the other topic that town manager was
Reading water.
referring to was
Water.
North Reading Water. So if the town wants to move forward, we'd have to have a town meeting for North Reading Water discussion, and Yeah.
Well, we'll get to
December.
North Reading Water later in the agenda, but the timing should be geared towards that, if in fact a timing is necessary for North Reading Water, and not
Yeah.
a time that accommodates both, because I just think a December 11th meeting, in mid-December in the middle of the holidays, is not a time for any special town meeting to make a big decision.
Okay.
Andrew, with the citizens, did you mention senior citizens, is that part of the however many people?
Yes.
So like two at large, one of those would be senior?
And additional to the residents is a member of the senior community.
Andrew, can you clarify, you've got 4 liaisons. Are the liaisons
No.
true liaisons, or are they voting members of any committee that may choose to take a vote?
They're true liaisons.
Okay, so just from a clarification perspective, liaisons have no voting authority.
Nope.
The meetings should be scheduled around the full members, not necessarily around the liaison schedule. These are publicly posted meetings, so they'll be available, posted according to publicly posted meeting guidelines, taped as well. So we'll get Andover TV to help support that as well.
Right, so there's board liaisons who assumingly will report back to their respective boards and committees.
Right.
And then there's staff liaisons that can provide expertise.
So the total number of actual individuals on the committee is,
Just increased by one.
Just increased
it's
by
what? 1, 2, 3,
11. I think it's 11.
11. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Just have a clarifying question. Earlier, there was some discussion about why earlier this committee was set up to look at zoning, and now it's specifically focused on the project. It seemed logical to me because at the last meeting when Mr. Lopoli presented, I thought he talked about approaching the project differently. He's no longer asking for a zoning change, right? Isn't he asking for, there was some other vehicle that he was using?
So again, not to speak for him, he indicated to the board that he was going to proceed with a project, whether it be by right or with a zoning change. So what he had suggested to the board,
Just for his parcel, right?
right, was a PUD. A PUD is not allowed in ID2 right now, so it would still require a town meeting vote to allow for it.
But it would just be for his parcel, right?
And for people who don't know what PUD is.
Planned unit development.
It's specific to a development. Which is why I'm
It's more
saying it
project
seems to make
specific.
sense that therefore the committee would be specifically focused on that development, because no longer is this going to be brought to town meeting as a zoning change. Is that
Well, that was
correct?
in response. That was in response to the other parcels being subject to and not knowing what would happen to the other parcels if residential were to be
Right,
approved
and I
for an
think that-
entire ID2.
I think that there could be more controversy, right, if you're talking about what happens to the other parcels, and if you're focused on this development, so.
But it would be the same action required of town meeting, which is a supermajority vote.
But for that parcel, not for all the parcels?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we can move on.
Just point of clarification, what is the pleasure of the board? To come back with the further revised, to vote the revised so we can move forward with populating?
We're moving
we-
slowly, but...
We're meeting next Monday, so I can come back.
Let's do that next Monday then. If that's the pleasure of the board. We can just get have him revise the charge based upon this discussion. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Okay?
Okay.
Good.